A single father opens his door to a girl weeping on his doorstep, unaware that beneath her tears lies a hidden truth that will change both their lives forever. This chance encounter between a kind-hearted man and a seemingly destitute young woman conceals an extraordinary secret about her true identity as the daughter of one of the wealthiest executives in the country. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith stood frozen on his creaking porch, rainwater dripping from his battered cap as thunder echoed through the quiet neighborhood. The evening shift at the warehouse had been grueling, and all he wanted was to check on Jacob and collapse into bed. Instead, he found himself rooted to the spot, listening to a sound that didn't belong, a trembling voice calling out from the shadows, raw with fear, but stubborn with resolve. "Excuse me," the voice said again. "Is the room still available?" John squinted through the downpour, his hand instinctively reaching for the porch light switch. The yellow glow revealed a young woman, perhaps 22, huddled beneath the porch overhang. She clutched a worn black suitcase to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white with tension. Her blonde hair, darkened by rain, clung to her pale cheeks in wet tendrils. Though tears mixed with raindrops on her face, something in her posture, a certain straightness of the spine, a lift of the chin, spoke of dignity that refused to be washed away. "I saw your sign," she continued, nodding toward the faded room for rent notice he'd taped to the window weeks ago and nearly forgotten about. Her voice wavered but didn't break. John shifted uncomfortably, water pooling around his work boots. The sensible thing would be to tell her to come back tomorrow, in daylight, when the storm had passed. Pine View Lane wasn't exactly the kind of neighborhood where strangers appeared on doorsteps after dark. Yet something in her eyes, a familiar desperation he recognized from his own mirror not so long ago, made him hesitate. "It's late," he finally said. "Neither invitation nor dismissal." "I know." She stepped forward slightly, into the weak circle of porch light. "I wouldn't ask if I had anywhere else to go tonight." Another crack of thunder punctuated her words, making them both flinch. In that brief illumination, John noticed how her clothes, though thoroughly soaked, were of good quality. The suitcase, despite its worn appearance, had the unmistakable shape of expensive luggage. This wasn't someone who belonged on the streets, yet here she stood, shivering on his porch in the pouring rain. John thought of Jacob asleep inside, of the empty room that had been waiting for a tenant for months, of the bills piling up on the kitchen table. He thought of what it meant to turn someone away on a night like this. "You got ID?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. The young woman nodded, relief flickering across her features. "Yes, thank you. She paused, swallowing hard. "My name is Clara." "Are you lost?" John Smith asked, uncertainty clear in his voice as he eyed her shivering form beneath the yellow porch light. Rainwater pooled at her feet, creating dark patches on his welcome mat. She shook her head, raindrops scattering from her blonde hair as she gestured toward the faded room for rent sign taped haphazardly to his front window. The paper had curled at the edges from weeks of sun and recent rain. "I'm not asking for a handout," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming of rain on the roof. She pulled out a wad of damp bills from her jacket pocket, the edges softened by moisture. "I just need somewhere to sleep tonight. I can pay up front. $200, all I have." John studied her face, noticing how she maintained eye contact despite her vulnerable position. Something about her didn't fit the usual story of someone desperate for shelter on a night like this. Her clothes, though soaked through, were clearly of good quality. The black coat she wore had subtle designer stitching at the cuffs, and even drenched, it hung on her frame with tailored precision. "$200's more than a month's worth," he said, crossing his arms as another gust of wind drove rain against the house. "Sign says $75 a week." She held herself with a grace that didn't match the desperation in her voice, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, the posture of someone who had been taught to maintain dignity in all circumstances. "Please," she said, offering the money again. "I don't care about change. I just need a door that locks." Lightning flashed, illuminating the street behind her for a brief moment. John noticed there was no car, no taxi pulling away. She'd arrived on foot in this weather, carrying nothing but that worn suitcase. He glanced back into his modest home, thinking of his son Jacob sleeping upstairs. Then back at the young woman. Her eyes held a weariness that seemed too heavy for someone her age. "You running from something?" he asked, his protective instincts as a father kicking in. "Not something," she replied, clutching her suitcase tighter. "Just looking for somewhere." John hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. The father in him worried about letting a stranger into his home. But something in her composed desperation reminded him of himself years ago, when a single act of kindness had made all the difference. "Got any ID?" he asked, already stepping aside to let her in. "You got a name?" John asked, rainwater still dripping from his jacket onto the welcome mat. His eyes remained cautious, yet kind, as he studied the young woman's face in the dim porchlight. She hesitated, her gaze darting briefly to the shadows beyond the yard before returning to meet his. Something in her expression suggested she was weighing her options carefully. "Just Clara," she answered softly, her voice carrying a hint of refinement despite her bedraggled appearance. She clutched her worn black suitcase tighter against her chest, as if it contained everything precious she had left in the world. The leather was expensive but weathered, suggesting a life far different from its current circumstances. John Smith nodded once, accepting her answer without pressing further. He turned the key in the lock, the mechanism clicking loudly in the quiet, broken only by distant thunder. The door swung open with a familiar creak, revealing the modest but tidy interior of his home. "Floors creak. Leave your shoes by the door, and try not to wake the kid," he instructed, his tone gruff but his gaze gentle. "Jacob's a light sleeper." Clara nodded gratefully, slipping off her soaked flats and placing them neatly beside a tiny pair of mud-caked sneakers. The sight of the child's footwear seemed to soften something in her expression. She stepped over the threshold as if she were entering sacred ground, and the scent of rain and something faintly floral followed her in. An expensive perfume that seemed at odds with her current state, though John couldn't place exactly why. The living room was small but warm, with a worn couch and a coffee table scattered with coloring books and crayons. A single father's home, lived in and loved. Clara's eyes took in everything, from the framed crayon drawings on the wall to the stack of library books on the side table. "Thank you," she whispered, standing awkwardly in the center of the room, unsure where to place herself in this unfamiliar territory. John switched on a small lamp, casting the room in a soft glow. "You can put your things down," he said, gesturing to her suitcase. "I'll show you where you'll be staying." Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her knuckles remained white around the handle of her luggage. For a moment, she looked younger than her years, vulnerable in a way that stirred something protective in John's chest. Whatever her story was, whatever had brought William Montgomery's daughter to his doorstep on this stormy night, he sensed it was more complicated than a simple tale of a girl who lost her way. The house was modest by any standard. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, faded wooden floors that creaked with every step, and furniture clearly assembled from years of thrift store finds. Yet compared to the raging storm outside, it felt like sanctuary. The walls, though thin, held warmth, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingered from whatever John Smith had baked earlier that day. John led Clara down the narrow hallway, a single bulb casting long shadows across family photos hanging in mismatched frames. His mind raced with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. Who was she running from? What had driven this clearly educated young woman to his doorstep on such a night? The practiced caution of a single father warred with his instinct to help. "This is your room," he said, pushing open a door to reveal a small space with a twin bed pressed against the wall. A simple wooden dresser stood opposite, its surface bare, except for a reading lamp with a slightly crooked shade. Small, but the bed's good. Sheets are clean. Clara lingered in the doorway, her fingers still clutching the handle of her worn black suitcase. She exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath for days. John noticed how her shoulders finally relaxed, dropping slightly as she surveyed the humble space with what looked strangely like relief. "Bathrooms down the hall," he continued, gesturing vaguely to his right. "Hot water takes about 30 seconds to kick in. Kitchen's yours too. Just label your food if you buy any. I've got a 6-year-old, Jacob. Good kid. Curious though, so he might ask you a million questions in the morning." The father's voice softened when he mentioned his son, and for a moment, his weathered face looked younger. Clara nodded, taking in the information without comment. The house was nothing like what she was accustomed to. No marble countertops, no vaulted ceilings, no staff waiting to attend to her needs. Yet something about its lived-in simplicity felt more genuine than anywhere she'd been before. "Towels are in the cabinet under the sink," John added, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I'll be up at 6 for work, but I'll try not to wake you." He turned to leave, then paused. "The front door locks automatically. Side door doesn't, just so you know." The unspoken message was clear. She could leave any time, no questions asked. It was perhaps this silent offering of freedom that made Clara feel, for the first time in weeks, that she might actually be safe. "I won't be any trouble, I swear," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but steady. The determination in her tone contrasted with her fragile appearance. Clothes still damp from the storm, blonde hair disheveled, yet something in her posture suggested she was accustomed to maintaining composure even in difficult circumstances. John Smith studied her for a moment, noticing how she stood with her shoulders squared despite her exhaustion. There was a quiet resilience about this young woman that he couldn't quite place. She didn't carry herself like someone who typically needed shelter on stormy nights. Her mannerisms, the way she kept her chin slightly raised, how her fingers delicately gripped the handle of her worn suitcase, hinted at a life far removed from desperation. "Bathrooms down the hall if you want to clean up," he said, his gruff tone softened by genuine concern. "Got some extra towels and blankets. Nights get cold in this old house." He disappeared briefly into the hallway closet, returning with a neatly folded towel and a thick woolen blanket that had seen better days but remained clean and serviceable. As he handed them to Clara, their fingers brushed momentarily, and he noticed how cold her hands were. "Thank you," she managed, her eyes suddenly shimmering with gratitude so profound it pinned John in place. For a fleeting second, he glimpsed something beyond her composed exterior, a vulnerability that made him wonder what circumstances had driven someone like her to his doorstep on such a night. The single father shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her gratitude. He wasn't accustomed to having strangers in his home, especially with Jacob sleeping just down the hall. Yet something about this young woman's desperate situation had stirred his compassion, reminding him of times when he too had needed kindness from strangers. "Night, Clara," he said simply, stepping back toward the hallway. "Kitchen's through there if you need water. Jacob's a sound sleeper, but try to keep quiet all the same." She nodded, clutching the towel and blanket to her chest like precious gifts. As John turned to leave, he heard the soft click of the door closing behind him. Through the thin walls of the modest house, he could hear her exhale deeply, a sound of pure relief, as if she had finally found a moment of safety after a long journey. Inside the small room, Clara pressed her back against the door and closed her eyes, finally letting herself breathe. For the first time in days, she allowed her shoulders to drop and her guard to lower, if only slightly. John Smith stood alone in the kitchen, the old fluorescent light humming softly overhead as he poured himself a glass of water from the tap. The encounter with the mysterious young woman left him with a gnawing uncertainty in his stomach. Should he have asked for identification? References? Any proof that she wasn't running from something worse than rain? He took a long sip, feeling the cool water wash down his throat as he leaned against the worn countertop. The single father had always prided himself on being cautious. Life had taught him that lesson the hard way. Yet something in Clara's eyes had spoken of genuine need, not deception. There was a dignity there, even in her desperation, that resonated with him. "Am I being naive?" he whispered to the empty kitchen. The house creaked in response, as if considering the question. His gaze drifted to the refrigerator, covered with Jacob's artwork, held up by mismatched magnets. One drawing in particular caught his attention. A crayon masterpiece of a crooked house with a triangular roof and 3 stick figures standing hand in hand outside. "My family" was scrawled across the top in his 6-year-old's uneven handwriting. The third figure had been added recently, drawn in a different color than the others, with no clear identity. John touched the drawing gently. His son had always been hopeful for expansion in their little family of 2, ever since his mother had left them 3 years ago. The thought made his chest tighten. He walked to the window and peered through the blinds. The rain continued to fall, transforming the street into a river of reflected porch lights. How many others were out there tonight, soaked to the bone, with nowhere to go? The thought of Clara wandering those streets made his decision feel right, despite the risks. John rinsed his glass and placed it in the dish rack. He'd always taught Jacob that kindness mattered more than caution sometimes. Perhaps it was time he lived by his own lessons. He checked the locks on the doors, a habit he'd developed since becoming solely responsible for Jacob's safety, and switched off the kitchen light. For tonight, at least, he would choose trust. For tonight, kindness would be enough. As he headed toward his bedroom, John paused briefly outside the door where Clara now slept. No sound came from within. He continued down the hallway, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet, carrying the weight of his decision and the hope that tomorrow would prove it right. Morning brought a damp hush to the small house on Pineview Lane. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the clearing sky and a freshness that permeated through the slightly open windows. John Smith padded down the hallway in worn slippers, steaming coffee mug in hand, pausing briefly as he passed Clara's closed door. He wondered if she was still sleeping, or perhaps lying awake, planning her next move. In the living room, he found Jacob sprawled on the faded area rug, still in his dinosaur pajamas, running his battered toy truck along imaginary roads. The vehicle's red paint was chipped at the corners, revealing the metal underneath. But the boy cherished it nonetheless. "I heard someone come in last night," Jacob said without looking up, his small fingers guiding the truck around a makeshift obstacle course of cushions. His voice held that particular blend of innocence and perception that only 6-year-olds seem to master. John settled into his armchair, blowing gently across the surface of his coffee. "Her name's Clara. She's staying for a while," he explained, keeping his tone casual though his mind still raced with questions about their mysterious guest. "Is she nice?" Jacob asked, finally looking up at his father with wide, curious eyes. "I think so, buddy. She needed a place to stay, that's all." Just then, soft footsteps approached from the hallway, and Clara emerged, looking considerably more composed than she had the previous night. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that, despite its weariness, carried a natural elegance. She had folded the towel and blanket John had given her with meticulous precision and held them against her chest like a shield. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle yet carrying a hint of the refined upbringing she was trying to conceal. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jacob abandoned his truck immediately, scrambling to his feet with the uninhibited enthusiasm of childhood. He studied her with unabashed curiosity, taking in her clean but simple clothes and the careful way she held herself. "I'm Jacob," he announced proudly. "I'm 6. Do you like trucks?" A smile softened Clara's features, transforming her face completely. "It's very nice to meet you, Jacob. 6 is a wonderful age," she replied, crouching down to his level with natural grace. "And yes, I do like trucks, especially red ones." John watched this exchange silently, noting how easily she spoke to his son, without the condescension adults often used with children. For all her obvious discomfort and the secrets she clearly carried, there was something genuine in her interaction with Jacob that eased some of his concerns. Jacob beamed at her, and she crouched to his level. "You must be Jacob. 6 is a great age. I was 6 once too." He laughed, and John felt the tension melt away as he watched his son's eyes light up with childlike wonder. "Did you have toys when you were 6? Jacob asked, holding up his battered truck for her inspection. Clara Montgomery nodded, gently taking the toy and turning it over in her hands with genuine interest. "I did, but none as cool as this," she said, rolling the wheels against her palm. "This looks like it goes on many adventures." John observed the interaction from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand. There was something in the way she spoke to his son, not condescending, but with authentic respect, that made him relax his guard just a fraction more. Over the following days, Clara settled into their routine with surprising ease. She kept her rented room immaculate, bed always made with hospital corners that spoke of discipline beyond what most young women her age would bother with. She moved through the house like someone accustomed to being invisible, tidying spaces without being asked and never leaving a trace of herself behind. "You don't have to clean up after us," John told her one evening after finding the kitchen spotless when he returned from his late shift. Clara just shrugged. "It helps me feel useful," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Besides, you're working hard enough as it is." She began leaving small notes for him on nights he worked late. Simple messages propped against the microwave or taped to containers in the refrigerator. "Eat before you fall over," one read. "Leftovers inside. Heat 2 minutes," said another. These small gestures of consideration seemed to come naturally to her, though John couldn't help wondering where she'd learned such thoughtfulness. Jacob, with his uncomplicated 6-year-old heart, took to their new housemate immediately. At first, he called her Miss Clara with childish formality, making her smile each time. "Just Clara is fine," she told him, while helping him build a tower of blocks on the living room floor. "Clara," Jacob tested the name, nodding seriously, as if approving it. "Can you stay for a long time?" John, overhearing from the hallway, tensed at the innocent question, but Clara's response was measured and honest. "I'm not sure how long I'll be here," she said, carefully balancing another block, "but I'm very happy to be your friend right now." The formality between them faded quickly, replaced by a comfortable familiarity that warmed the small house in ways John hadn't expected. The evening shadows stretched across the living room as Clara Montgomery sat cross-legged on the carpet with Jacob. Between them lay squares of colorful paper she'd purchased from the corner store with her dwindling funds. Her slender fingers moved with practiced precision, folding and creasing each sheet into delicate shapes. "Like this?" Jacob asked, his small hands fumbling with the paper. "Almost," Clara replied, leaning forward to guide his fingers. "Fold this corner to meet the other, then press down firmly." Her touch was gentle yet confident as she helped him create a perfect crease. John Smith paused in the doorway, a mug of coffee warming his palms as he watched them. There was something mesmerizing about Clara's movements, each fold deliberate, each crease made with care that spoke of years of practice. "You're good at that," he said, his voice soft with admiration. Clara looked up, a hint of surprise crossing her features before she smiled. "I had a lot of time alone growing up," she replied, her eyes dropping back to the origami. Folding paper was quieter than talking. Something in her tone suggested volumes of unspoken memories. Jacob held up his completed crane with pride. "Look, Dad, Miss Clara taught me to make a bird." "That's amazing, buddy," John said, ruffling his son's hair as he set his mug on the coffee table. As the evening progressed, Clara helped Jacob create an entire flock of paper cranes. They arranged them across the windowsill, a colorful parade of folded hope. The 6-year-old beamed with accomplishment, his earlier troubles at school temporarily forgotten. Later, after dinner dishes were cleared and Jacob was bathed and pajama-clad, Clara discovered an old copy of The Secret Garden on the bookshelf. "Would you like me to read some?" she offered, her voice tentative. Jacob nodded eagerly, climbing onto the couch and patting the space beside him. John, intending to finish some paperwork, found himself drawn to the living room instead as Clara's voice filled the house. She read with natural cadence, bringing the characters to life with subtle changes in tone. Her voice carried the story of Mary Lennox with such warmth that John found himself sinking into the armchair, paperwork forgotten. Jacob's eyelids grew heavy as Clara turned page after page. John watched them both, his son curled trustingly against this stranger who somehow no longer felt like a stranger at all. Her voice wove a spell around the modest living room, transforming it into something richer than its worn furniture suggested. When Jacob finally drifted to sleep, Clara continued reading softly for several more minutes. John realized with startling clarity that both he and his son had found comfort in her presence that neither could properly explain. The kitchen was quiet, except for the gentle clink of dishes and the soft splash of water in the sink. Jacob had finally drifted off after 3 bedtime stories and a glass of warm milk, leaving John Smith and Clara alone with the evening chores. John handed her a plate to dry, studying her profile in the soft yellow light above the sink. After 2 weeks under his roof, she remained a mystery wrapped in kindness. "You don't talk about your past," he ventured gently, passing her another dripping dish. Clara looked down, her fingers working methodically with the dish towel. "Not much to talk about," she whispered, but her eyes told a different story. John didn't press further, but his mind cataloged the subtle contradictions that had been puzzling him. Her posture, even while scrubbing stubborn food stains, remained elegant, spine straight, shoulders relaxed but never slouched. No one had taught him to stand that way in his working-class neighborhood. The father noticed how she spoke too, her words carefully chosen, her grammar impeccable even in casual conversation. When she helped Jacob with homework, she explained concepts with the patience and precision of someone well-educated. Then there were the small luxuries she couldn't seem to live without. The scent of expensive almond and orchid hand cream lingered whenever she passed, not the drugstore brand he recognized from the local pharmacy. Her shampoo bottle, glimpsed on the edge of the bathtub, bore the distinctive logo of a 5-star hotel chain. Clara placed the last plate in the cabinet, her movements graceful and economical. Her hands, though now slightly reddened from dishwater, showed no calluses or rough patches, hands that had known comfort, not labor. "More tea?" she asked, already reaching for the kettle, anticipating his nod before he gave it. John leaned against the counter, watching as she prepared 2 mugs with the same care she might have given to fine china. Her words carried warmth when she spoke of Jacob's progress at school or the garden she hoped to start in the spring. Yet whenever the conversation turned to her, that warmth retreated behind a carefully constructed wall. "Thank you," he said, accepting the steaming mug, their fingers brushing momentarily. "For the tea?" she asked with a small smile. "For being good to Jacob," John replied. "Kids know when someone's genuine." Something flickered across her face, pride perhaps, or relief, before she nodded and sipped her tea. Whatever secrets Clara carried, John realized they hadn't touched the core of who she was. And perhaps that was enough for now. The soft strains of Vivaldi's 4 Seasons drifted through the thin walls of John Smith's modest home. Clara had discovered an old radio in her room and tuned it to the classical station that played each afternoon. The refined melodies seemed oddly fitting against the backdrop of worn furniture and creaking floors. Like Clara herself, something elegant nestled within the ordinary. John paused outside her door one day, listening to the music swell. He recognized the piece from somewhere, perhaps a movie or a commercial, but Clara would know its proper name, its composer, its history. These small reminders of her mysterious past appeared in unexpected moments. The way she folded napkins at dinner, her perfect posture even on their sagging couch, how she pronounced certain words with a precision that spoke of expensive education. His curiosity about her true identity grew daily, but John chose silence over interrogation. Whatever had driven William Montgomery's daughter to his doorstep that rainy night was her story to tell when ready. For now, he was content with the peaceful rhythm she had brought to their lives. The way Jacob's homework was checked each evening, how dinner appeared on the table even on days when John worked late at his construction job, the fresh flowers she placed in a jar by the window despite their modest budget. One evening, returning from a double shift, John found them on the living room couch. Clara's blonde hair spilled across the armrest. Jacob curled against her side like a small cat seeking warmth. An illustrated copy of The Hobbit lay open across her chest, her fingers still marking their place mid-adventure. The boy's toy truck remained clutched in his small hand, even in sleep. Standing in the doorway, watching their gentle breathing, John felt something unfamiliar bloom inside his chest, a tender, fragile hope he hadn't allowed himself since Sarah's death 3 years ago. The feeling frightened him with its intensity, this sudden certainty that his broken little family might somehow be healing. He moved quietly, draping the faded quilt over them both. Clara stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open just enough to register his presence before closing again, trusting him completely in her vulnerability. In that moment, John realized that whatever secrets she carried, whatever wealth or privilege she had abandoned, Clara had given them something money couldn't buy. She had made their house feel like a home again. The classical music playing softly from her room had become the soundtrack to their shared lives, cultivated and unexpected, yet somehow perfectly right. The truth revealed itself on a dusky Tuesday. Clara hummed softly while drying dishes, her slender fingers working methodically over each plate. John watched from the kitchen doorway, noticing how she'd fallen into their routines as naturally as if she'd always been there. Jacob's laughter echoed from the living room, where he played with his beloved toy truck, the sound weaving through their modest home on Pineview Lane. "You're good at this," John remarked, stepping forward to help, "making things feel like home." Clara smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's easy when you have something worth caring for." As she reached for another dish, a delicate silver locket slipped from her pocket, landing on the linoleum floor with a soft, betraying clink. Time seemed to freeze as they both stared at the gleaming object. John bent down, his weathered hand closing around the necklace. It was heavier than it looked, clearly expensive, not something you'd find at the thrift stores where he shopped. Curiosity and concern mingled in his chest as he held it up. "May I?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara nodded, her face suddenly pale. "It's all I kept," she whispered. The locket opened with a practiced click. Inside were 2 photographs, a man and woman in expensive formal wear, their features sharp and familiar. The man's stern eyes and commanding presence seemed to reach through the picture, making John's skin prickle with recognition. The woman beside him had Clara's same delicate nose and determined chin. John turned the locket over, finding an inscription etched in elegant script. "To Clara, love, Dad." And beneath that, a name that made his heart pound against his ribs, William R. Montgomery. The name hung in the air between them. William Montgomery, the real estate tycoon whose company had bought out half the neighborhood, whose developments had forced 3 families John knew into cheaper housing across town. The man whose smiling face adorned billboards promising luxury living where community gardens once stood. Clara's hands trembled as she took back the locket, her fingers closing protectively around it. "Now you know," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. John stood motionless, trying to reconcile the gentle woman who read bedtime stories to his son with the daughter of the man who represented everything he resented about how their city was changing. The pieces suddenly fit: her refined speech, her careful manners, the way she sometimes looked at ordinary things with such wonder. "Clara Montgomery," he said, testing the name. She flinched as if he'd struck her. "Just Clara," she corrected, her voice barely audible. "Please." The name was impossible to ignore. William Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Properties, the tycoon whose company had bulldozed homes, canceled community projects, and whose face smiled coldly from every city billboard. John felt a chill run through him as the connection formed in his mind. The same Montgomery whose development plans had forced his former neighbors out of their homes 3 years ago. The same man whose company had replaced the community garden with a parking structure. Clara's eyes went wide with fear and shame as she realized what John was holding. Her shoulders tensed and the color drained from her face. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I can explain." But the words seemed to die in her throat, replaced by a silent plea. John handed the locket back without a word, his expression unreadable. The silver trinket felt heavier than it should, weighted with implications and questions. Clara clutched it to her chest before disappearing down the hallway, her footsteps quick and light against the creaking floorboards. Left alone in the kitchen, John slumped into a chair at the table. The dishes remained half-dried, forgotten in the wake of this revelation. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to reconcile the gentle woman who read to his son with the daughter of the man who'd caused so much hardship in their community. Outside, the street lamp cast long shadows across the small kitchen. John remembered the day the eviction notices had appeared in his old neighborhood. He remembered Mrs. Geller, 83 years old, weeping on her porch as the Montgomery Properties sign went up where her rose bushes had grown for decades. Yet the Clara he knew folded paper cranes with Jacob. She washed dishes without being asked. She left kind notes and spoke with a gentleness that couldn't be faked. How could she be connected to the empire that had displaced families without remorse? Through the thin walls, he could hear her moving in her room, not packing, not fleeing, just pacing, waiting, perhaps for judgment. John remained at the kitchen table until midnight, unable to sleep, turning over questions in his mind. What was she running from? Why choose his modest home of all places? Was this some elaborate game, or was she truly seeking refuge from a world of privilege that had somehow become a prison? The clock ticked steadily on the wall, counting the seconds of this new reality. By morning, John would need to decide whether Clara's last name changed who she was beneath his roof, or whether the kindness she'd shown mattered more than the Montgomery legacy she carried. With trembling fingers, John Smith typed Clara Montgomery into the search bar of his ancient laptop. The device hummed and whirred, struggling to process the request as he sat alone at the kitchen table. The house quiet, except for the occasional creaks of the old wooden floors. When the results loaded, his breath caught. There she was, the same gentle eyes, the same blonde hair, but transformed by designer gowns and professional makeup. Photos from charity galas showed her standing beside William R. Montgomery, the real estate tycoon whose company had systematically demolished affordable housing across the city. The same man whose development plans had forced John to move from his childhood neighborhood 3 years ago. "My God," he whispered, scrolling through images of Clara cutting ribbons at hospital wings bearing the Montgomery name, attending red carpet events, and posing for Society magazine covers. In each photo, she smiled the practiced smile of someone who'd been taught how to appear happy without necessarily feeling it. John closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had welcomed into his home the daughter of the man who had displaced countless families like his own. The man whose gleaming skyscrapers now stood where community gardens once thrived. Yet the Clara he knew wasn't the polished heiress from these photographs. She was the woman who stayed up helping Jacob with his reading, who fixed the leaky faucet without being asked, who folded laundry with careful precision. The woman whose classical music selections drifted through the house like forgotten memories of something beautiful. John walked to the kitchen window and gazed out at the pre-dawn darkness. He thought about confrontation, about demanding answers, about asking her to leave. But then he remembered Jacob's laughter. Real, uninhibited laughter that had been absent for too long, as Clara taught him to make paper cranes yesterday afternoon. With a deep breath, John reached for the flour canister. By the time the sun began to rise, the small house was filled with the warm, comforting scent of freshly baked cinnamon bread. He made tea with honey, arranging everything on a tray with a handwritten note. In this house, if a daughter needs a father, even for a few days, I can try to fill the part. No questions asked. He placed the tray outside her door, then headed to work early, giving her space to decide what happened next. Some truths were complicated, John knew, but kindness rarely was. The aroma of freshly baked bread gently pulled Clara from her sleep. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains as she blinked away the remnants of dreams. For a moment, she forgot where she was, not in her palatial bedroom at the Montgomery estate, but in the small, honest room John Smith had offered her that stormy night. Clara slipped out of bed, her bare feet padding across the worn wooden floor. Outside her door, she discovered a small tray waiting, a plate with 2 thick slices of cinnamon bread still steaming, a mug of tea with honey swirled into it, and a folded piece of paper. The care in this simple gesture made her throat tighten. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the note. John's handwriting was unpolished but sincere. In this house, if a daughter needs a father, even for a few days, I can try to fill the part, no questions asked. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Clara pressed the paper to her chest, feeling the weight of acceptance wash over her. He knew. John knew exactly who she was. The daughter of William Montgomery, the man whose company had probably affected his own life. Yet here was kindness without judgment, offered freely. She carried the tray to the small desk by the window, watching a pair of cardinals flutter in the neighbor's oak tree as she took her first bite. The bread was still warm, sweet with cinnamon and something else, perhaps the comfort of being seen as just Clara, not as an heiress or a Montgomery. From the living room came the sound of Jacob's laughter, followed by his father's deeper chuckle. The 6-year-old had school today, and Clara could hear John helping him pack his lunch, their morning routine continuing despite the revelation that hung in the air between the adults. Clara wiped away her tears with the back of her hand. She had expected confrontation, accusations, even eviction. Instead, John had baked bread. The simple act of nurturing spoke volumes. It was everything her biological father had never given her despite his billions. She finished her tea and straightened her shoulders. Instead of packing her suitcase and disappearing as she'd initially planned, Clara opened her door and stepped into the hallway. The silent understanding between them, that she could stay, that her secret was safe, that her past didn't define her, created a fragile truce that felt more valuable than anything money could buy. For the first time since leaving the Montgomery mansion, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future beyond tomorrow. Not one built on wealth and appearances, but on the kind of authentic connection that flourished in this modest house on Pine View Lane. She took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen, toward Jacob's cheerful voice, toward John's quiet strength, and toward hope. 3 days later, Jacob Smith trudged through the front door, his small shoulders slumped and his sneakers caked with mud. Clara noticed immediately that something was wrong. The usually cheerful 6-year-old had tears streaking his dirt-smudged cheeks. "What happened, buddy?" she asked, kneeling to his level. "Tommy said my shoes are garbage," Jacob whispered, pointing to his worn-out sneakers with fraying laces and a hole near the big toe. "He said only poor kids wear shoes like these." Clara gently guided him to the bathroom and sat him on the edge of the tub. with tender care. "You know," she said, carefully cleaning the mud from his ankles, "when I was little, I had lots of fancy shoes, more than I could wear." Jacob looked up, his eyes wide. "Really? Like a princess?" Clara smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "Something like that. But those shoes didn't make me happy. They were just things." She wrung out the cloth and continued cleaning. "You're not what you wear, Jacob. You're what you do for others." The boy considered this. His brow furrowed in concentration. "Did your dad teach you that?" he asked innocently. Clara's hands paused momentarily. She swallowed hard before answering. "No," she said softly. "It's what he forgot." Later that evening, after John had tucked Jacob into bed, thunder rumbled outside, reminiscent of the night Clara had first appeared on their doorstep. She and John sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs of tea. "I've never seen you that way with him before," John said. "What you told Jacob about shoes and worth, that came from somewhere deep." Clara traced the rim of her mug with her fingertip. "I'm ready to tell you everything," she whispered. As rain lashed against the windows, Clara Montgomery revealed her story. How her father William had systematically demolished a neighborhood for luxury condos, displacing dozens of families. When she'd discovered documents proving he'd bribed city officials, she'd confronted him. "He laughed in my face," she said, her voice breaking. "Told me I was naive, that this was how business worked. When I threatened to go public, he said no one would listen to a girl who'd never worked a day in her life." John listened silently, his hands clasped tightly. "He told me if I wanted to see the real world, I could go play poor for a while," Clara continued. "So I left with just enough to survive. I lost my wallet the first night. Then I found your porch." She looked up at John, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I came looking for shelter from the rain. I never expected to find a home." "I confronted him," Clara said, her voice quivering as she sat across from John at the kitchen table. The night had grown quiet, with only the occasional car passing outside their modest home on Pineview Lane. "William, my father, was planning to demolish an entire neighborhood for another luxury complex. When I questioned him about the families who would lose their homes, he just laughed." John watched her hands tremble around her mug of tea. His arms remained crossed, but his eyes held a softness that encouraged her to continue. "He told me no one listens to a girl who's never worked a day in her life," she continued, bitterness edging into her voice. "Said my education at private schools and charity galas didn't qualify me to lecture him about social responsibility." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. His exact words were, "If you want to see the real world so badly, go play poor for a while. See how long you last without my money." She looked down at her simple clothes, so different from the designer outfits she once wore to events alongside William Montgomery. "So I packed one suitcase and left. I had some cash in my wallet, but I lost it somewhere between the bus station and here." A sad smile crossed her face. "Then the storm hit, and I found your porch with that faded rental sign." John uncrossed his arms, his weathered hands resting on the table. "You could have gone anywhere. Why here?" "Because this place wasn't trying to be something it wasn't," Clara answered simply. "Just like you." The 6-year-old's laughter echoed in their memories. Jacob's joy had become a constant in the house since Clara's arrival. "You gave me bread and tea that first morning," she whispered, reaching tentatively across the table, not quite touching John's hand. "You didn't ask questions when you had every right to. Jacob laughs in his sleep again. He told me so himself." Her words trembled with gratitude. "You fixed more in a week than my father did in a lifetime." John's expression softened further. "We're not fixing each other, Clara. We're just being a family." The word hung between them, fragile, hopeful, unexpected. "I don't want to go back," Clara admitted, her voice barely audible. "Not to that life, not to him." "Then don't," John replied simply, as if offering shelter from another storm. Outside, the streetlight flickered, casting gentle shadows across their faces. Two strangers, who had somehow become each other's refuge in a world that had given them every reason to distrust. The sleek black SUV appeared like a shadow, gliding down Pineview Lane with predatory purpose. For 3 days it lingered, sometimes parked across the street, sometimes circling the block. John Smith noticed it immediately: the tinted windows, the polished exterior that cost more than his annual salary, the way it seemed to watch their modest home. "Stay inside with Jacob today," he told Clara one morning, his voice low as he peered through the curtains. She nodded, understanding without explanation. On the 4th day, the confrontation came. John was raking leaves when the vehicle pulled directly into his driveway. A tall man in an immaculate charcoal suit emerged, his leather shoes gleaming against the cracked concrete. "Mr. Smith?" "Thomas Langley, executive aide to William Montgomery." The man extended a business card between 2 manicured fingers. "I believe you're harboring his daughter." John straightened, rake still in hand. "Nobody's harboring anyone. She's renting a room." Langley's smile never reached his eyes. "Mr. Montgomery is concerned about his daughter's well-being. He's prepared to compensate you generously for your hospitality." He opened a leather portfolio, revealing documents and what appeared to be a cashier's check. $50,000, plus a guarantee of no legal action regarding your unlicensed rental arrangement. From inside, Clara watched through the window, her fingers pressed against the glass. Jacob stood beside her, sensing the tension without understanding its source. "Tell William his daughter isn't property," John replied, deliberately using the tycoon's first name. "She's 22 years old. She makes her own choices." Langley's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Mr. Montgomery is a powerful man with significant influence in this city. Your employment situation, your mortgage, even custody arrangements can all become complicated." John stepped closer, lowering his voice. "She doesn't need a palace. She needs to be a person." His eyes were steady, his stance unwavering. "Clara stays if she wants to stay." "This isn't over," Langley warned, sliding his card into John's shirt pocket. "Mr. Montgomery doesn't lose. Not ever." He returned to the vehicle, its engine purring to life with expensive precision. That evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "He'll come back," she whispered. "My father never gives up control." John nodded, watching Jacob arrange toy cars on the living room floor. "Then we'll be ready." Neither spoke the obvious truth hanging between them. Their fragile peace had been discovered, and William Montgomery had the resources to shatter it completely. The executive aide had left, but the threat remained, a storm gathering on the horizon, waiting to break over their small, newfound family. Clara Montgomery had spent years watching her father build his empire through questionable means. Now, sitting at John's kitchen table, with a folder of documents she'd quietly collected before leaving, she made her decision. With trembling fingers, she dialed Eliza Warren, an investigative journalist known for her integrity, and arranged a discreet meeting at a coffee shop 3 towns over. "Are you sure about this?" John asked, his weathered hands resting on her shoulders as she prepared to leave. She nodded. "It's not revenge. It's responsibility." The story broke like a thunderclap. William R. Montgomery's empire began crumbling as headlines exposed systematic corruption, backroom deals with city officials, and the human cost of his luxury developments. Documents revealed how Montgomery Properties had manipulated zoning laws, forced families from generational homes, and destroyed community landmarks for profit margins. Within days, their quiet street transformed. News vans lined the curb, reporters clutching microphones stood on the sidewalk, and photographers with telephoto lenses lurked behind trees. The modest house on Pineview Lane became the unlikely epicenter of a citywide scandal. "Ms. Montgomery, did you deliberately set out to destroy your father's company?" shouted one reporter as Clara hurried Jacob inside after school. The boy clutched her hand tightly. "Why are they so angry, Miss Clara?" "They're not angry, sweetheart. They're just loud," she explained, shielding him from the flashing cameras. What surprised them most was the neighborhood's response. Mrs. Ramirez from next door brought over casseroles and stood guard on their porch. Mr. Chen from the corner store redirected reporters with false information. The Garcia brothers, teenagers from across the street, formed a protective barrier whenever Jacob needed to play outside. "We take care of our own," Mrs. Ramirez told a persistent cameraman. "And she's one of us now." John received calls offering substantial sums for exclusive interviews. Clara found business cards slipped under their door daily. They declined them all. "We don't need to explain ourselves to anyone," John said one evening as they sat in the darkened living room, curtains drawn. "What matters is right here." Clara nodded, watching Jacob sleep with his head on her lap. "I spent my whole life in mansions filled with people who wanted something from me. This is the first place that's ever felt like home." Outside, the media circus continued, but inside their walls, they found something the cameras couldn't capture: the quiet authenticity of chosen family, built not on wealth or status, but on the foundation of a single act of kindness on a rainy night. A year had passed since that stormy night when Clara first appeared on John Smith's doorstep. The modest house on Pineview Lane remained outwardly unchanged, the same weathered siding, the same creaking porch steps, but inside, everything had transformed. Where once a faded room for rent sign had hung in the window, colorful paper hearts and delicate cranes now decorated the glass, Jacob's small fingers having folded each one under Clara's patient guidance. The original rental receipt, now framed, hung by the front door, $200 in damp bills that had changed 3 lives forever. John often paused before it, remembering the rain-soaked young woman who'd stood trembling on his porch, never imagining she would become family. Clara now taught art classes 3 afternoons a week at the newly built community center. The building stood proudly on the very plot where her father had once planned to erect luxury condominiums. The irony wasn't lost on the locals, who had rallied behind her when the Montgomery scandal broke. Children flocked to her classes, drawn to her gentle patience and genuine interest in their creative expressions. "Miss Clara, look what I made!" a young student would exclaim, and she would bend down, giving the child her complete attention, something her own father had never done for her. In their neighborhood, she was simply Clara now. She had shed the Montgomery name like an ill-fitting coat, finding more warmth in the simple life she'd built than in all her father's wealth. William remained in the city, his empire diminished but not destroyed. They had not spoken since the exposé, though she occasionally received formal correspondence from Thomas Langley about her trust fund, letters she filed away unopened. Jacob, now 7, had blossomed in the presence of Clara's nurturing spirit. He called her Mom sometimes, testing the word cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, as she responded each time with a smile that reached her eyes. On a quiet Tuesday evening, as autumn painted the trees golden outside their windows, John took Clara's hand across their modest dinner table. Jacob was already asleep, his toy truck parked beside his pillow. Without fanfare or grand gestures, John slipped a simple ring made from folded paper onto her finger. A crane transformed into a circle, a symbol of permanence crafted from fragility. "It's just until I can afford a real one," he whispered. Clara closed her fingers around it, tears welling in her eyes. "This is the most real thing I've ever had," she answered. Their home, built on courage, kindness, and second chances, was finally truly full.